Indian subcontinent has been home to cities and towns of different size since antiquity. But the history about urban settlements in this subcontinent isn't a continuous one. It contains disjunctions. Western historians have generally categorized Indian civilization as a rural one. Although India is now home to more than 12,000 urban settlements. In 1915, Sir Patrick Gates started his pioneering work on the historiography of Indian urban settlements from a sociological point of view in the University of Bombay. Post-independence, renowned scholars of geography and sociology have ventured into this field. Several questions have been raised. What is the relationship between an urban settlement and its hinterland? Where is the center of an urban settlement? How is it aligned? The answers to these questions can give us more insight into the rise and fall of Indian urban settlements.
The Mughal cities had created admiration from the Mughal period itself. The problem remains is that although the urban areas in India are supposed to be the largest in the world with territory as well as in population, the historians had not looked very much on the study of the Indian cities. Actually, the first one was started by a sociologist, Patrick Geddes, in 1915 from Bombay University. And then the Madras Geographical Association took this up in the 1920s and 30s. By 1970, the geographers and the sociologists combined had produced about 40 books on the Indian cities. Compared to that, the work of the Indian historians is very limited. Particularly when we talk about the morphology, which is our subject today, morphology of the medieval Mughal city. This topic is practically untouched by the historians, excepting by a few, like Professor Nurul Hasan, who wrote one article on morphology of Delhi in the early 18th century. So therefore, what we do is we construct some kind of a framework for an understanding of the morphology of the Mughal city in India. Now, in looking at this morphology, one need to see that what is a morphology. First of all, to define it a little bit, morphology is generally termed to the internal pattern of the city itself, which of course is not only influenced by internal factors but also by outside factors that we'll see later. Now, there are several kinds of cities in Mughal India. One can divide it into different types. For example, the capital cities, Delhi, Agra, Delhi, Lahore, Fatehpur Sikri. I omit Fatehpur Sikri from here because we don't know much about the city itself. We know about the palace complex, which we don't discuss here in this. Then there are the provincial headquarters, which become quite large. Dhaka, for example, in Bengal, Ahmedabad in Gujarat, other places were there also. Then third type is the kind of a port towns like Surat, Hooghly, Cambay. And then we have the market towns about which we know very little. The one or two that we know had developed into a bigger city, and one, if we have time, I'll certainly go and see one such city like Burhanpur in the Deccan. Now, in these different types of cities, they had their own kinds of morphology, because this morphology is influenced, as I have said, by both internal and external factors. One of the things of Mughal Indian cities is that these cities are larger than those of the Sultanate, number one. And number two, that these cities are to a great extent influenced by various kinds of trade, both internal and external, particularly overseas, in which textile had played, particularly cotton textile, had played a very, very significant role. Now, we do not go into that kind of a debate of the factors influencing the city, but we'll see a little bit. Now, in this kind of influences, there were two factors, broadly speaking, which are important. One of which is particularly important in case of capital cities, Agra and Delhi. We would not go into Lahore because we would not have that much of time. But we'll see Agra and Delhi later in a slightly more detailed fashion. Now, this agricultural production of the neighboring villages is the most important for the city for several reasons. One is that it brings food. Second is that in Mughal India, unlike that of the Sultanate India, a land is attached to the city itself. Whether it is a port town, whether it is a market town, or whether it is a capital town. The revenue of the land and the product of the land are all included in the income of the city. This is a factor that many historians had failed to notice. It has been given by Abul Fazl very clearly in Ain-i-Akbari, and in the case of all the cities and the towns, Abul Fazl had given the exact quantum of territory and the revenue, etc. So there is no question of any haphazard guess or anything like that. Now, as a result, for example, which we'll perhaps we'll see later, that in case of Surat, if one says that the income is 15 lakh rupees a year, this does not mean that the income is from the custom duty of the overseas trade. The income includes overseas trade customs, inland trade customs, and also the revenue of the attached land. So, greater the city, greater the quantity of the land attached, and greater, of course, is the revenue. Now, if we understand that, then we would see the influence. The influence is that in case of the bigger cities like Agra and Delhi, the agricultural products do not come straight into the city itself. These products come normally opposite the river, exactly opposite the river, in the wholesale market, from where these are transported into the city by retail dealers. So therefore, there is the question of the growth of the suburbs. Apart from this, because of the overseas trade, these suburbs contain the residences of the artisans as well as the merchants, and in case of Delhi, sometimes even of the nobles, because they do not find places inside. So therefore, for the growth of the morphology, one would have to see the internal as well as the external factors. Now, for the morphology itself, which is what we call the streets, the things, etc., our principal source in this Mughal period are the accounts of European travelers. There are certain Persian sources, like Bhimsen, who wrote on Burhanpur, where he was born. Or there is the Murarka-e-Dehli in 1739 by another person. There are the 19th century, early 19th century writings also of Sangin Beg, for example, on Delhi itself. But the principal accounts of the European travelers form the principal sources on the understanding of the morphology of the Indian cities. Now the problem is that they do have their own biases and attitudes and contradictions as well. To give one example, 17th century, from mid 17th century, the European travelers began to look into the Mughal Indian cities from the point of view of the European cities. For example, they tried to see whether the streets are paved, whether the streets are parallel, whether the streets are straight, whether it's a Giridon system, which is a cross system, or things like that, whether the houses have windows and doors, what kind of windows they have. All these kinds of things the travelers have noticed, and they are not unanimous, unfortunately. Some of them contradict each other. But apart from that, we get an idea of the morphology of the Indian cities. So leaving that apart, the attitude and the bias of the European travelers, we see in some of the capital cities the question of the walls, the city wall, which is a very important factor for the European traveler. I do not know why, because perhaps it's the European experience. Then the population, then the composition of the population, the function of the population, all these, the communities and things like this. So from the accounts of the European travelers, we get a kind of one kind of morphology. The other kind probably could come from the excavations, but unfortunately we do not have many. There were some in the late 19th century on Agra and Delhi, and they did confirm principally the writings of the foreign travelers. So there is this problem of these things. Now, Europeans writers, 19th century onwards, some particularly the English writers, they had written on the cities itself. But these are the accounts of isolated cities. They did not try to integrate or to make a pattern of a city itself. This English view, some said it's a colonial view, which I doubt, but this kind of view was changed slightly by the coming of the Americans, who looked more at the pattern of the city, the center, the downtown, at linkages with the outside, more geographical in nature, more sociological in nature rather than historical. The French, on the other hand, they had done some excavations, particularly after 1950. I don't know why it's after 1950, but after 1950 in the Middle East. And they had given more or less the morphology of some of the very big cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and so on and so forth. Other Persian cities as well. The Italians had dwelt more on the internal politicking, the dominating groups within the city itself, in which the morphology is also a part. Indians had tried to take all this. For example, Oshin Dasgupta's Surat had tried to take more the Italian version than others, although he used English and the Dutch sources. But there are not many, as I have said, on the studies on the Mughal Indian cities. There was one on, some Europeans had written on Delhi and Agra, but these are more or less pictorial things. On Delhi, of course, there are a large number of English writers, description of the tombs, monuments, mausoleums, and so on. These do not give us any idea of the morphology of the city itself.
In 1915, Sir Patrick Getz had started his pioneering work on the historiography of Indian urban settlements from a sociological point of view in the University of Bombay. In a sense, India is the largest urban civilization in the world. Urban population in India is far greater than that of the USA. After Patrick Gates, the Madras Geographical Association carried out extensive research between 1920 and 1930 on the history of Indian urban settlements. Post-independence, scholars of geography and sociology have published around 40 books on this subject. In the Mughal period, urban settlements were hierarchically categorized, such as capital city, provincial headquarters, port town, commercial town, etc. Abul Fazl has described several features of urban settlements in his treatise Ain-e-Akbari. He has particularly touched upon the revenue system of the Mughal capital. There are two principal sources for gaining insight into urban settlements in the Mughal period. One of these is the Persian historiography and the other is the European one.
Now, morphology of a medieval Mughal city, I think, is influenced by two particular elements. There are exceptions to this, but generally by two particular elements. One is the fort, and fort is not merely a fort. Fort includes, almost like a city itself, it includes the palace, it includes the market, it includes the mosque, it includes the residential area not only of the clerks but also of the troops, it includes the daftar khana, the office, and so on and so forth. So this fort is a very important one. And in this fort, particularly in the capital city, there is one element which is very important in the morphology itself. And that element I call sacred space. It is the living room of the emperor and the harem, where no other male can come. And it is this sacred space that is connected with the divine power of the emperor itself. Emperor is the shadow of God, and therefore this kind of divine power is ascribed to it. And from Humayun we can see a little bit on this, but from Akbar this comes out very clearly, and Abul Fazl made no secret about it. Badauni unfortunately is not very happy with that kind of thing, but Abul Fazl is very clear on what Akbar is trying to state. So this kind of sacred space in a capital fort, in a capital palace, is fairly important, because it then becomes the center of the activities of the political life of the empire. I would not say center of the activity of the city itself, but of the political life of the empire, which in turn influences the events in the city. The second element that has influenced the morphology to a great extent is the river. Most of the Indian cities, if not all, are located on the bank of the river. And because of this, the river plays a certain important role in the morphology itself. For example, if the river takes a turn, then in the bend, or before the bend or after the bend, the morphology is different. So therefore, the morphology is important because the fort is almost always located at the bank of the river at a very particular strategic place. And then the nobles, they began to live on both sides of the fort on the bank of the river. So the entire bank is almost managed by the nobility, the emperor and the nobility as well. Then the city starts, and the city starts from the fort itself. When I said that the river plays an important role in the formation of the morphology of the city, I do not mean that all the cities in the medieval period have this kind of an element in it. for example, which I have not included here, is Vijayanagar. Vijayanagar is not on the bank of the Tungabhadra. It is actually very distant from Tungabhadra river. It's within the mountains, particularly for the security reason. Early Delhi in the Sultanate period, the first one of Qutbuddin, that was also similarly placed. So there are certain exceptions, but these should be taken as exceptions. The city actually starts from the fort, in the sense that in front of the fort, invariably, there is one Maidan which is called Chowk, generally of square or 8-cornered, surrounded by shops, moving shops in the afternoon or in the evening, about which Bernier had spoken glowingly while describing Delhi. And from there it then goes either in 2 or 3 straight roads outside. But this movement of the street, that is movement which is straight, almost parallel to each other, parallel often with the river, this movement is only one movement of the city. This is important movement because on both sides of the street, the shops are lined in such a way that this becomes almost a market. That is, the entire chalk to the gate outside becomes one market. But this is not the only movement within the city. There is another movement, and that movement is from the main street inside the city, a kind of a winding small roads, also covered with shops, maybe on one side, called mahallas in Persian. Now these are the small winding lanes that go inside, which is a different kind of a movement, not a straight one, not parallel, not necessarily giving vent to an expression, giving expression to something big, but it is very congested. It is full of shops and markets and people and residential houses and so on and so forth. So there is one, what we call the static position of the city, the chalk, the street. And this static position is having conflict with the movement inside, movement of people, movement of the shops, shopkeepers, movement of horses going through, or the elephants. So therefore, the city, a medieval city, is not a stagnant one. Is not like the 19th century stagnant city of India. It is a moving city, always in movement, with political movement sometimes social movements, sometimes festivals, but the movement is always there. Now in this morphology, in which we find one, the straight, broad avenue, and on the other, closer to it, cutting across at different angles, at different places, smaller winding lanes going through, both are equally important. Because here in a Mughal city, there is no class distinction in residential areas. Both rich and poor, they live perhaps in the same locality without much of conflict and without much of a riot or anything about which we do not know. The other feature is in this morphology that generally the Hindus and the Muslims lived separately. But in certain areas, and particularly during from the latter half of the 17th century, when the population pressure and the pressure on the cities began to grow, then the two communities used to live side by side, and there has been not a single reference or example of a communal riot before 1715. That one was a kind of a religious one, but that was perhaps the only one before 1757. Now these elements, there are certain other elements which you would see. These elements constitute what is known as the morphology of the Indian city.
In 1915, Sir Patrick Getz had started his pioneering work on the historiography of Indian urban settlements from a sociological point of view in the University of Bombay. In a sense, India is the largest urban civilization in the world. Urban population in India is far greater than that of the USA. After Patrick Getz, the Madras Geographical Association carried out extensive research between 1920 and 1930 on the history of Indian urban settlements. Post-independence, scholars of geography and sociology have published around 40 books on this subject. In the Mughal period, urban settlements were hierarchically categorized, such as capital city, provincial headquarters, port town, commercial town, etc. Abul Fazl has described several features of urban settlements in his treatise Ain-e-Akbari. He has particularly touched upon the revenue system of the Mughal capital. There are two principal sources for gaining insight into urban settlements in the Mughal period. One of these is the Persian historiography and the other is the European one. Urban settlements in the medieval period were built near forts and rivers. However, there have been exceptions to this rule. Vijayanagar, for example, was situated far away from the river Tungabhadra. French traveller Barnier has written about the roads, markets and shops in Delhi. Remarkably, Hindus and Muslims have lived side by side in the Mughal cities and towns without any communal tension. There is no mention of communal strife in recorded history till 1715.